Today I'm with Himali Singh Soin, an artist of multiple mediums, as we will soon discover. Works between India, Europe, UK, etc., and many destinations. And I've been really interested in her work on landscapes and the way she thinks about them and the way she locates herself and the way she frames this in the moment of the Anthropocene. So today we'll be talking to her and trying to understand from her what drives her, what are her questions about her art practice and her impulses for doing it. So Himali, thank you very much for joining me. And the conversation is as free as you'd like it to be, and it is a format which actually follows your thoughts. So we'll start with however you want to start.
How lovely. Thank you, Ravi, for inviting me. And also, as I said just before we started recording, that there is no me in a multi-species universe. We're thinking about the I's, the you's, the we's, and then the us's here. And sometimes those we's and us's are not unified, we and us, but we are thinking about different ways of osmosing and conversing with humans, non-humans, and even perhaps more than humans. I suppose for me, I've always been outside trekking and walking with my parents who are explorers, and there has been a constant conversation, listening to my mom speaking to her plants. There's been a constant conversation with the natural world. But of course, this natural world over particularly this last decade feels not very natural anymore. So the conversation has moved from speaking to the waves to speaking to the nets that wash up with these waves. It's been speaking to the lake, but looking at the lake glistening with lithium and thinking that looks beautiful. I know that that's an oil spill, but it's making these kind of glimmering rainbow colors on it. And what do I do with that feeling of feeling that same sense of beauty when I look up at like a sublime mountain when I look up at a lake that's glistening with oil?
Right.
I think it also kind of this feeling really inhabits the contradictions that we live with. It's not anymore a nostalgia for a previous nature. It's actually becoming closer to this new kind of artificial, disgusting, grotesque natural world as well. Certainly, you probably feel this.
Yes, you're right. And what will the new nature be is the question. And how do we make the new nature different than the old nature, not just an extension of the new nature? But you use many ways to express this and to articulate this through your work, through your expression, which ranges from music to poetry to letter writing to stamp making to visual arts to performance, what have you. So that's a lot of personhood you put inside this question.
Yeah, one of the reasons for all of these mediums is, of course, the joy of collaboration. But it was in that beautiful book called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, edited by Anat Singh and Heather Swanson. And they talk in the foreword about how climate change right now is not something that we can access through a scientific discourse alone or policy alone or even poetry alone, that it requires the collaboration of multiple media and multiple languages, therefore, to be able to understand this very entangled life that we are living right now. And that feels like all of these projects that span music and poetry and film and embroidery now feel like they are trying to actually bring together like a polyphonous, octopus-like universe together, that then we can all make something out of it, something bigger than the sum of our parts. So the last 6-7 years now have been spent after I went to this residency in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And the poles are, have you been to
I have
either?
never been. I'd love to go.
The poles are unlike any other space on Earth. The reason why I first went there was because I was researching a lot of outer space. As a poet first, for me, outer space was like the most perfect palette. You're dealing with just the night sky, stars, delayed light. There's all these metaphors through which you can talk about earthly life, but you're not bound by identity politics, by nationhood, by the geopolitics of this world. So I thought Antarctica and the Arctic would be kind of similar spaces. And I went there and I realized these are not spaces, they're places. And they're bound by the same kind of geopolitical angst as the rest of the earth is. You know, in Antarctica, you have all these research stations that are claimed by every country that owns it. In the Arctic, of course, you have indigenous people and you have basically melting land that is losing itself, and therefore languages that are losing themselves, stories that are losing themselves. So one of the things for me, the first feeling I had was how there is this indigenous element in the poles, and that is the ice itself. It's an elder and it's a library. It's an archive that literally, as a material, preserves everything that is in it, but it's melting so much faster that for a long time it did its decolonial work. So in the Arctic, you have stories of how the ice, because the permafrost has melted, it's pushed up graves and revealed like colonial intent. But it's melting at such a great rate that it can't even tell those stories anymore. So one of the methods I found was actually trying to get inside the material of the ice and tell stories from its perspective. And I wore this kind of alien suit made of space blankets, and it becomes a very interesting material because it's what NASA uses on its machinery in outer space. So you're both an alien in that landscape, but it also absorbs heat and preserves you in that way. So there's this kind of interesting reflection and absorption always taking place within that. And one of the poems I wrote was How She Became Ice. And that poem was actually me in this white landscape, this brown body in this white landscape. And she finally arrives at this coal mine in Pyramiden, in an old Soviet town in the Arctic. And she finds a friendship with that coal mine. I think this is something maybe you're thinking about in these conversations within this new multi-species world, that she sees the blackness of the coal mine, and that's more familiar to her than the white landscape. And she feels the heat, even though it's a fossil fuel, she feels the heat that it could produce. And she feels a sense of friendship, being an equatorial being herself. So it's a complicated perspective into climate change. It's not as easy as she doesn't want that coal mine to exist.
Beautiful.
And so here in the course of the film, she begins to actually feel such a deep sense of empathy with the landscape that she feels herself turning into ice. This is the poem. A clear inverted mountain floating above the horizon. For historians, the present had lost itself over time. There were no shadows, echoes of no surface. Nobody left to be beautiful. The ghost of what was to come singed. The last frayed edges of what she knew had wilted. Her gelid fingers traced the tapering glaciers marbled with mud. What had survived was ancient, She found fossils of ferns stamped in stones from way back when. Her own landscape had once been opposite like that. The ice moved through her for a few hours, a mineral messenger. She felt like a fjord. She'd take kidneys over the North Star and water over watches. She'd take time. She'd take misdirection, indecision, intuition, suspension over disbelief. She'd take the third person over you. Or the sun and the moon at rest. Not rest like stillness, but the kind of rest in music, a string held taut, an interval with the pedal down. She'd take the confusion, the hysteria of light, the heft of its lurch sideways. The ice fortified her. Fronds of frost stung, spikes spreading like cables pushing signals through. Antennae attuned at frazzle frequencies. Beneath her turban, she could hear the grating ring of silence, the screech of crystals forming, futures foreseen, the tangle of tubular seaweed, the rinse of starfish with no hearts and double the hunger. The opacity leaked out of her blood and her bones, spectral. All the heat had dispersed. Her broken chronometer preserved in ice, still recording two types of error, the imperfection of the image exposed and the great distance it represented. When examined with a telescope, it proved to be our distance from one another. Dead reckoning, adjusting for parallax. Distances were deceptive due to atmospheric clarity and the absences of trees. The gloop of algae and nets and straws and long-distance love letters congealed the ocean into a jungle. Gelatinous gossip. Quartz, astral, petrified, phosphorescent flares. She went inside the boat, anchored never too close to shore. She was thawing, dripping afterlife. Still, a thin haze persisted. She was translucent.
So beautiful. The stories which the non-human tell and the affinities which are held in those stories between animals, other beings. And we've come to believe that we are the only species which tells stories, actually. Stories are told in so many different ways, which keep the non-human world together and in experience of their lives, which we deny that they have any, in a sense. So the stories are probably not only with what we call living, but of what we call inanimate as well.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of brings me to this beautiful photograph of yours called Classification, because in a way, the Victorian kind of colonial project was to tell these stories, but through this very cold, measured classification, taxonomizing nature in a way. And I think this is I don't think this problem will ever go away for me, but it's that I use the English language to do this storytelling.
But you also use other languages. You use the language of music, for example, and the language of visual and the language of the body.
Yeah.
So these are all I see all these as part of your languages of expression. But you also bring them together.
Sorry?
You also bring them all together. Like you just described this experience in the Antarctic, and maybe we can put a link of that fantastic performance on your webpage later.
Mm.
But also the Nandadevi work
Mm.
that you do is also, actually it's an ongoing work, really. It has not come to any closure.
No work comes to any closure. It's all, in a way, the work I call static range a hyper object, because like climate change, it has taken on its own persona, and now it tells me what to do and I kind of obey it. I'm like, yes. So it's not going to end. But also, yes, there are these multiple languages and multiple disciplines. But I also think that within the English language, there is an attempt to not put these sort of classified labels onto things. It's to allow leakages even between works themselves to occur. So, going from the polar glaciers into the Nanda Devi glacier, that feels like a kind of continuity. And suddenly works begin to speak to each other. I went to a nuclear reactor site in Wales. Well, actually, I went to a nuclear site in Sellafield in Cumbria. And then I went for the polar project to where the Arctic terns breed. And the breeding ground turned out to be on a nuclear site.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly I felt these two works had kind of met each other and found each other. But also, there is an attempt to work through some of these feminist perspectives into climate change that is just not, it has nothing to do with females or the feminine at all, but it has to do with finding a language of respect between these, the natural, the new natural, and ourselves, and maybe not finding a less demarcated language anyway, in the way that these lovely creatures in your photograph, which I have open in front of me, look in all directions, and their shadows are kind of.
Would you like to share the picture for people who might see it? Should I share the screen for you?
Sure.
Okay,
I can share.
So we know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So this is this beautiful picture that Ravi has taken in the Natural History Department of the University
of
Edinburgh. And they look like mini dinosaurs to me. So I love dinosaur thinking. Dinosaur thinking because it's a kind of thinking before human life.
Mm-hmm.
So it forces you to also think what might have come anterior to human thought in a way. And in a way, a lot of dinosaur thinking is also our reconstruction of the past, because we actually we can never understand what the dinosaur inhabited.
Right.
And so what we've done, for a movie like Jurassic Park for the first time, it's actually an imagination, a technological imagination of that roar of the dinosaur. We have no idea what it sounds like. So it's these if we can have these powers of imagination in thinking around what came before, we might have similar powers of imagination in thinking around what comes after, and perhaps then even allowing those befores and afters to loop a little bit. But also why I love this photograph is because they are hunched in different verticalities, and they're looking both forward and backwards and towards the front, and their shadow beings are kind of coexisting with themselves. So it's asking ourselves to also think about how these mediums and the way we think and these languages in which we think can create a messiness in time, so that time does not form such linear structures, and therefore we are able to inhabit a natural world that is not just accelerating towards some kind of hyper capitalist intensified other.
So you mentioned the idea of unknowability of the sound of the dinosaur and the imagination of it, and that's pretty much both a scientific venture of reconstructing the body and the throat and everything, but also an artistic venture in general of trying to think of the world outside. And you do that very well in the two projects I'm well aware of, one in the Antarctic, which you've mentioned right now, and in Nandadevi, which you have shared with me, your many forms of that work. It'll be very interesting to know from you what these two because they both deal with ice and mountains in barren landscapes, but also landscapes of affinity with themselves, and landscapes which have their own expression in a sense. They are landscapes in thought in themselves. If you can tell us a bit about these two works, and then expand on the work and how that took form, because a lot of that is trying to do what you just said, to know the unknowable, which is very much a question about our relationship with nature, the unknowability of it.
Maybe I can actually share my screen again.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So Static Range came after, all of these years of working on the North and South Pole. And I thought to myself, what is my third pole? Where do you go to after you've already been to the poles? And it turns out that the Himalayan plateau, specifically Tibet, is called the third pole of the world. And suddenly I thought, that this is my namesake. I'm named after these mountains, and I've lived there half of my life. This is where I'm going to. And of course, I'd heard of Nanda Devi throughout because my dad had gone on expeditions there and such. And I came upon this story, which bizarrely, just around the time when Static Range had begun to come out, the glacier of Nanda Devi also came apart, and it broke a dam, and it caused a flooding of this whole village. And actually, it was the villagers that started to talk about this story again, which is kind of testament to how it sits at the precipice of science and superstition a little bit. But the story is essentially that during the Cold War, the CIA collaborated with the Indian intelligence to place a nuclear-powered spy device on the mountain to spy on Chinese missile testing. And that region in China, the Xinjiang region, is now where the Uyghur concentration camps are housed. So there's a lot of layers of political messiness over here. But for me, what was interesting was that the political blurred with the personal, because when my father had gone on an expedition in the 70s, he had taken a photograph of Nanda Devi that then became a stamp by the Indian Telegraph Service.
Your father was a well-known mountaineer.
I was also assuming that I hadn't been born then. And so the film had actually had radiation in it. And therefore the stamp is already exposed to radiation. And therefore our bodies somehow have these speculative leakages in them as well. So the stamp kind of created a conceit for me to write a letter from the spy device, given it had seen things being a spy device, to the mountain. But similar to the character who goes to the coal mine and feels a kind of conflicted friendship with the coal mine, as I was writing the letter, I wasn't writing it. I feel like I'm a medium for all of this. And the voices I'm like calling upon the voices. As I was writing, I found that actually the spy device, even though it had potentially leaked this radiation and created this illness in the mountain, mountaineers have described that there were like sapphire glimmering caves from the heat of this device inside the mountain, literally creating holes in it. I felt that also the mountain had grown dependent on the device, that there was this heat that was possibly seductive to it. And they had built this kind of coexistent, dependent, toxic love relationship.
It's like the coal mine you described earlier. And
exactly.
Very
Exactly. And not unlike many relationships between humans and in love as well. That
we
often
never
that
know
love,
when they are toxic or not.
exactly, you never know. And it can also turn toxic. And then there's moments of these of friendship.
Yeah.
So that is the letter. The letter kind of explains this relationship. And then I expose the stamp speculatively with the help of nuclear researchers in the photographic medium
Nice.
To expose the stamp into what I call the nuclear sublime. So it's kind of like resplendent in all of these colors, and it's doing something that is the same trickery of what governments do to nuclear sites, that is make them into biospheres. The animation uses these like sublime colors to purposely make this a kind of beautiful experience, even though what you're watching is actually the mountain dying slowly. The sound, I'll play it just for a moment, is a pathway, a pill, a spillage, an image, age. So the monkey god avulsed the whole mountain with his hands and flew it across the ocean. Sound waves traveled from those quieted at a distance.
It's like, to quote Yeats, a terrible beauty is born.
Exactly. So the drums you're listening to are these nagaras that we got made in the Kamau. So this was also like a wonderful experience, just to be able to think,
These are
how
very
do we
traditional drums, aren't they? They are culturally very much a part of the life of the villagers there.
But surprisingly, they've become plastic. So the guy who did the beaten copper version, he hadn't made these in many years. He said no one wants these now. They're heavy and they're expensive.
And they still put hide on the top, or they put a
Yeah.
plastic sheet?
It's goat hide. These ones are the original
Yeah.
ones, but I think they put a plastic sheet now. So it was also really wonderful staying in the conceptual tenor of the project, but still being able to share the wealth within the local community.
And why did you think of the sound? Why did you think of these instruments?
So the Nagara drums are local to the Kumau, but they share with the Uyghur region in Xinjiang. And as it turns out, they are
Because
very
Nandadevi overlooks in some kind of way across the
exactly
Chinese
exactly.
peninsula, or not the peninsula, the Chinese landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they are common, and the drumming that you hear is actually David, who worked with Rachel Harris, who's an ethnomusicologist at SOAS, and she's one of the only people in the world that have recorded the Uyghur sounds. So we imagine that the spy device did not pick up only nuclear testing, but missile testing, but it also picked up underground protest songs. And so the sounds you hear are Uyghur rhythms, and all the static and glitches in the music are also made out of scratching the copper and like brushing against the goat hide. Nothing is artificial. So these become vessels almost to create a whole narrative of protest.
You're also creating a collaborative idea of community between Uyghur and the Kumaoni who live on the...
Well, unfortunately, they share something, and that's that they have 35% higher rates of cancer than the rest of India and China.
Wow, that's something to do with that device, you think?
And this is where the superstition comes in, that when there was a flood in the village, the villagers said it must be that device. Until then, there weren't very many stories about this at all. And it was just when we were starting to work on this and the flood took place that this story is back somehow in the news. But then what happened, kind of outside of my control, was that Hebrew Granta got in touch, and then we translated it into Hebrew and Arabic.
Yeah.
And that was, the Arabic translation took place just this summer when everything in Palestine again kind of blew up. And the translators wrote to me saying, you don't understand, this love letter has somehow spoken to us in ways you'll never understand.
Mhm.
And so for me, it seems quite interesting. And of course, the Nagaras are common to the Middle East as well. So it seems interesting how, without me doing anything, it feels like it can boomerang into different conflict regions. I had a friend embroider, and he's Palestinian. So this was also kind of an amazing link. But he found a motif that's common to the Kumaon and Palestine. So he embroidered the mountain in as a kind of tapestry as well. And then finally, we have two more pieces part of this, but we are using all of this media that's created to send the mountain long distance healing. And this is energy healing. These are indigenous traditions, as well as different ways of thinking about remedy and medicine. So we are sending, and we've already done a few of these healing sessions. And then we are also making like a phyto remedic garden. So wherever static range travels, I've already made one in the Himalayas. It's going to travel outside of Berlin. So we're working with specialists there to decontaminate the soil and absorb radiation or absorb whatever contamination is in it. So wherever static range travels, a garden goes with it.
So you feel that the idea of healing and affinity and listening, which runs through a lot of the stuff you're talking about, it's a way to break these silos of beings, separations.
Yeah, separations between disciplines too, right?
Yeah.
Because there's such a hierarchy between science and then the arts. And this is a way of saying we need to collaborate and use also, because we're working in a community that has different belief systems.
Yeah.
Why not listen to their belief systems?
Yeah.
And also, so actually Viveka, who's the healer, was my neighbor in the Himalayas. So she's also from there somehow, and we can pass and there's so much about invisible transmissions about this project. So the healing becomes yet another invisible transmission, but it somehow feels like, can we do a little bit to counteract the transmission of radiation?
So I'm thinking of your hope as an artist, because this is all work with a great amount of hope, because you are helping us, showing us affinity stories, and also suggesting ways out of what has been termed the political, in terms of violence or radiation, or the way you talked about that island where the radiation testing site, and the breeding of the birds was happening. This is like a meeting of two worlds, but you also talk of nesting and breeding on that world. To me, that these are all signs of hope, signs of. So have you thought about that as the artist's role in showing us something which we also always term as a crisis, but we don't know how to move out of it? We're caught in this terminology of the capital, the political, the extinction crisis, which we are located in. So do you also see that as a crisis of the self, in a sense?
I was just looking up the etymology of crisis. And actually, I think we've made it into disaster, but it actually just means a turning point where a decision must be made.
Beautiful.
So for me, I always joke and say that I think it was like Nietzsche and Camus, the kind of European white old men who had time to sit on their chairs and say, life has no meaning. We don't have that. We from the global south don't have time to worry that this suffering is going to lead nowhere. We only have space for hope. at this point. We've recently gone through some of the darkest periods of time in Delhi together and far apart.
Because I think suffering is part of every day.
It's a part of every day, and what happens then is that it's those very people that feel a sense of hope, because there's nothing further. So we are at the crisis point, and then we choose
Or the decision point.
Exactly. And then we choose the decision, and maybe I think it's just also thinking about time in different ways, which we can outside of the Western centric ideas of calendars and clocks and timetables. It's to think about time not as going back to some garden, but it's to think about the renewal, the rejuvenation, and the kind of cracks and openings. The crack can be a rupture or it can be an opening. And we have to think about where we can enter those, even if it means that on the other side, there's going to be a lake glimmering with oil spills.
Mm-hmm. So does that thought drive your work? That this kind of experience from the South and your experience of your own self?
Yeah, this time with Static Range, we also collaborated with an NGO. And we were able to raise so much funds for relief in the Himalayas, which, where everybody was focused on Delhi and Bombay, and nothing was actually arriving in the middle of the mountains. Yeah. In those moments, those people don't exist, and those mountains don't exist. So now it feels like, I feel like I'm an Aquarius. I'm a very hopeful person and idealistic by nature and temperament. And I feel like I never wanted to end a work where I feel like also if a work ends at a point of darkness, it ends and it's not open to interpretation, and therefore it's not democratic. I'm telling you what to think. If I leave it open, any kind of body or mind can enter into it and reinterpret, and therefore it continues. So that's the kind of conceptual nature of leaving it open. But the real practical part is that after having had this experience, I never want to make a work of art again that doesn't have a parallel community-based focus without making it like cheesy or anything. I know that now we can actually, I can commission Nagara drums, or we can share the wealth somehow, and it can do things. You quoted Yeats, and I quote Auden back to you, because he says poetry makes nothing happen, and I always say poetry makes things happen.
Right. And you relate a lot to your southern experience of your growing up here as a nature person in a mountaineering explorer family, and you bring this experience to contemporary forms of thinking about the futures of the world in terms of community, interdisciplinarity, multimedia, breaking all the traditional boundaries to see, as an artist, the role in helping show the future or point towards another way of thinking about things, like a point of decision, not a crisis. That's a way of thinking about it. Do you see that possibility because of your experience? Because of your notion of your own self? And do you see a difference in that when you travel to the West, the so-called West, and then you encounter different experiences, different beings, different ideas of the self, different sense of individuality, not necessarily a community? Do you see that difference, or is that difference exaggerated, or is it very personal only? Is it very individualistic?
I travel. I think I'm here in the UK or in Europe around 6 or 8 months of a year, and then I'm in India for about 4 to 6 months, depending. And I know that it switches my perspective every time. I say that I check my privilege in this way, and I say that it gives me new eyes in both places. But I won't so simply say, as our grandmothers used to say, they're not as community focused as we are. I don't think that is true. And I don't think we can make those distinctions. I think that there's a deep sense of friendship and love and community over here, and the way that I've experienced in like some places, people go out of their way to recycle one staple out of a tea bag. We have lost in India, we have lost that a level of dedication to our personal everyday lives completely. I've never encountered somebody who goes out of their way for a staple or one staple. So there's layers to it. Certainly, the way that some of these cities exist means that you live a hyper individualistic life because things are so expensive and you can't care in the same way. But I think mostly it's that immigration creates a really multiple community. And if that can happen, I always say interracial love or international love can just change everything, because you learn from each other and you take the best of each other. I think that both places need to learn from each other. I think that also time is experienced very differently. I spend hours in a day hanging out with friends in Delhi. And I have to put it into a calendar when we do that over here. And this is not speaking about social life, it's actually speaking about our interactions with the outside world, right? There's much more osmosis even in our architecture. We have verandas. There's a intermediate between the outside and the inside. Here it's so cold, you shut yourself out, and then the outside becomes a separate place. So I think both things influence and intimidate and mediate my experience. I just don't know if I can demarcate what is governing what.
So what kind of collaborations, contemporary collaborations, would you suggest, or do you think of, which are not based on these geographical sort of boundaries, not based in the post-colonial ideas of south-south, north-north, north-south, which are already demarcated with the colonial, sort of they're marked by the colonial. So you're suggesting other collaborations which are beyond these boundaries. So what kind of collaborations are possible? Artistic collaborations to think of new worlds.
Yeah. I think we went just recently, 2 weeks ago, in the Dolomites. We went on a site visit because there's a biennial there next year. And, we visited sites and we kind of heard some talks about the mythological aspects. And then one of the artists suggested that we go for a walk. And it was in that walk where you start to have those conversations, where you're actually looking down at the stone because you will trip if you don't. And then you're looking back at the big views. I would suggest that if we could all go for walks together, and again, our idea of walking in nature in India is very different from walking in the UK.
How is it different?
Walking in the UK is a whole system, and it's an infrastructure. And with that infrastructure comes hiking poles and jackets and things. There's a beautiful anthology called Black Nature, and it's about the African American experience outside. And it's all poetry. I would recommend it. But it kind of shows that, Black and brown bodies have a different relationship. Nature is either the thing that fires and floods, or nature is the thing that you can reap and sow. And we haven't really, till recently, hiking and camping and being outside hasn't really been a prerogative for us in India.
Yeah.
Which is why I always felt like what my parents were doing was kind of odd. And so did my friends. And now I think we're coming to different ways. Over here, people are imagining different pathways that are not just the kind of mowed down lawn to walk in, and then we are imagining ways of actually going out there and seeing what's beyond, just for the sake of it and for no other reason but to walk. And I think that's why I say this, that it's just such a wonderful way of exiting time, because when you're in time, you're walking towards a goal. And when you're walking for no reason but to walk, there is no teleological end. And so you're not walking forward or backward. And it gives you a sense of the stone, and it gives you a sense of what you've passed behind.
So you break this arrow of progress problem.
Yeah.
Counter it by being in the moment of the walk.
The mini dinosaurs that face both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And also what it does is then you're not just looking outwards. The shadow self, the shadows in your photograph, you're with your shadow self too. And what you see outside is a manifestation of inside. And then, this, at the risk of sounding too spiritual, that is the aim with thinking about nature again, right? It's that we think about the inner garden and see what have we done wrong that we have made this of this.
So we are very fluid cultural selves, and we need to link to other cultural selves to open ourselves to other ways of experiencing with and through each other.
And not thinking of distance as something that separates us, but distances as a force that's actually holding these paths together.
Like a field.
Like a field,
Yeah.
a magnetic field.
Magnetic field. Like which radiates.
Which radiates.
Radiates.
And sometimes that radiation is toxic, and sometimes that radiation is medicine.
It's great to see somebody like you, an artist, who then proposes new ways of being and thinking, and not just representing, but open up. I think that's a very important idea of art for me. And the reason to be an artist is to be curious and to explore in ways which the way you explore becomes art, because it can't fit it into any other category.
And the imagination, everybody has imagination.
Right.
So I invite you, and you invite me to enter with our imaginations and have a loopy conversation like this.
Yes. I think very, very, very great conversation. And as you know, we will be having more conversation in the near future because of the show in Mumbai, and which I'll write to you about soon. But this has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much more about the way you think and how you reflect on the conversation. And I think I look forward to what are the next things you have to show us.
Yeah.
In your future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for your very beautiful photograph. That's now going to stay with me.
Thank you.